Over the last few years, I've talked quite a bit about global politics, and I get great feedback from you guys about how this has helped you understand the world. But I've noticed the most disagreed and disliked opinion of mine is when I criticize the hawkish anti-Chinese rhetoric throughout Australian media and politics. Like this: love Ali, but this China boner is utterly stupid. Should rename the pod to Ali No Towing to China. I am surprised because Chinese sees mainly Indians and Pakis as subhuman. Subhuman? Listen to me, you Chinese simps. Us Pakis are actually superhuman. If you don't believe me, check out this leaked classified document. But look, I understand. I understand you're scared of a billion-strong militarized China right at your doorstep. Trust me, I'm gonna be living with the same fear from Australian Border Force once this video releases. Note to Department of Immigration, you've already given me citizenship. Please don't take it back. I'm too dependent on VB Longnecks now. This video will hopefully give you context to why I believe Australian foreign policy should not be anti-China. Foreign policy of any country, according to international relations theory, is driven by national interest. So what is Australia's national interest? One of them is making sure every serving of hot chips has a good amount of chicken salt on it. Wait, or maybe that's not it. The term refers to goals and ambitions of a country, whether it be military, economic, cultural, or otherwise. This only adds confusion, because who gets to define this national interest? The founding fathers of Australia, through Section 51 of the Australian Constitution, rested this authority with the Parliament, but particularly with the executive branch of the Parliament. In effect, the Prime Minister and his cabinet. After the Second World War, the whole world was redefining its national interest. Australia was not different. In March 1950, Australia's External Affairs Minister, Percy Splendor, who was likely an undercover Irish Terrier, under the Menzies government, laid out what Australia's national interests are. And these tenets till today arguably dictate Australia's foreign policy considerations. He defined them as, quote, preservation of peace and our way of life. Preservation of peace refers to any foreign aggression or occupation, and the way of life encompasses the economic objectives and a fair go for every Australian. So based on this priority list, made by the political establishment, we can apply it to the Australian context and try and figure out what our international posture is supposed to look like. First, security. As an island nation, our isolation is the biggest deterrent for any foreign aggressor. The islands of Java, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands act as buffer states for Australia. If any aggressor wants to take over, they first need to take control of these buffer states. Additionally, with most of our population centers around the southeast of the country, some 2,000 kilometers away from Darwin, the trek to take over Canberra is no easy feat even for the most powerful armies of the world. This makes Australia one of the safest places on the planet in terms of foreign occupation. You are still very likely to die from the giant prawn falling on your head, so don't get too relaxed. Taking our geography into consideration, any foreign military power would bend over heels to strike a settlement with us before they launch a full-scale invasion. In our history, World War II was the only instance where we faced some sort of genuine insecurity. Second, economic security. Australia's population size plays a major role in our economic security. As a nation with a relatively small population, we cannot depend on our domestic market alone to ensure we maintain a high standard of living. We depend highly on other markets overseas that can buy our commodities like gold, iron ore, coal, and agricultural produce. And of course, the biggest of them all, bigger cheese. As a consequence, it is a national interest of ours to ensure a secure passage for our maritime trade with the world. As a middle power that does not have the naval capabilities to ensure this, we have throughout history depended on another big power to ensure our maritime security. These tenets of economic security and defense dictated Australia's foreign policy even prior to the Second World War. As a small community of British subjects isolated from the mainland, Australian decision makers relied on Britain to ensure these objectives are secured. The British, with their unmatched naval superiority and market for Australian raw product exports, were the natural allies. Even then, whenever this relationship deviated from Australian national interests, Australian politicians were not too fearful of showing the Palms a stern look. Like during the Second World War, they delayed Australian imperial force to fight to ensure that the British agreed to a good price for Australian wheat crops. The post-Second World War period and the demise of the British Empire, the Menzies government felt that the US was in the natural position to ensure our national interests are protected. They clearly were the largest naval power now, and with a huge domestic market for our goods. But early on in the relationship, it became clear that the Menzies calculus was flawed. The US did provide us with naval security, but behaved like a competitor otherwise. Because you see, the US is actually quite similar to us. They too depend on commodities like agricultural produce. So even though they preach free trade principles of comparative advantage, in practice, they legislated strong protectionist policies to ensure that Australian produce does not take over. To be fair, why would you? It is in the United States' interest to keep superior Australian produce away from their markets to ensure domestic business keeps going. It was Menzies who was the idiot and assumed that their propaganda was legitimate. This dichotomy was becoming more and more clear in the post-war years, with a trade treaty being signed with Japan in 1957 in spite of US annoyance. A rising Asia was slowly appearing to be a natural ally in ensuring our economic interests are met. The US from the get-go was not too pleased with our ties with Asia. Considering US was the world hegemon with the strongest navy, we continued to appease them with policies that were to our economic loss. This caused frictions within the Australian political establishment, with Labour politicians advocating for a more independent foreign policy that is not dictated to us by the US. In 1972, Labour leader Whitlam takes office and advocates adopting a more independent style of foreign policy from the US, looking to open ties with the rest of Asia. This was not an acceptable position for the United States, and in 1975, under trumped-up charges, an elected Prime Minister Whitlam was kicked out of office. If you want to get more juicy details of the CIA coup, check out a video made by this little-known YouTuber called friendlyjordies. Link in the description below. But not yet. Wait till this video ends. Jimmies can do with a few less views, okay? With the dramatic nature of US influence in our politics, Labour realized that their more independent foreign policy ideas were not going to go down well with the powers that be, so they instead attempted to strike a compromise. Labour pitched the following: US will remain integral to our security relationship, allowing them to set bases on our soil and we fight their dumb wars like Vietnam and Iraq, but in return, Australia gets to reap the economic advantages of a rising China and its appetite for Australian commodities. The Liberal Party was also starting to realize the economic advantages that opening up the economy to Asia was already bringing, and for their own survival in the long haul, accepted this compromise and sought American approval. The US, although apprehensive, reluctantly agreed, taking into account that no power in Asia has the sort of military might that risks Australia's likelihood of jumping ships. The bipartisan compromise has clearly done wonders for the Australian economy. Under both parties' successive governments, particularly Hawke and Keating, Australia went from a middle-income economy to one of the richest in the world. You know, a thriving economy kind of helps in giving people a fair go. This all needs to change. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 and later Trump has again put Australia at a point where we need to make critical decisions and the status quo of the past will need to change. Why?
China. That's why.
The rise of China from an agrarian society to an industrial power, but critically, a growing military and naval power has changed US's calculus. Barack Obama's government very early on started to indicate to Australia that their economic relations with China are no more acceptable. In 2010, another elected Prime Minister was overthrown after advocating that it is not in Australia's national interest to blindly follow US dictation. Kevin Rudd argued for a more balanced approach to foreign relations that does not seem too one-sided for China. Kevin Rudd was subsequently overthrown, And immediately after, Obama came to Australia, choosing Canberra as his launching pad with his pivot to Asia speech, making Australia a key pawn in its launch of the Grand Battle. It's important, irrespective of what side of the debate you're on, to evaluate why China acts the way it does. The Chinese perspective. China, unlike the US, is not self-sufficient in energy. To fuel its huge economy, it depends on foreign imports of fossil fuel. 80% of their oil comes through narrow straits of Malacca. This vulnerable spot, if blocked by any foreign force, would paralyze their economy. This is the Chinese Achilles heel. So now, you're a Chinese leader and you notice that in addition to the US becoming increasingly hawkish, they are setting bases all around the Straits of Malacca, including Darwin, a place strategically located near the strait. If Australia is seen to be overly chummy with the US, this will be perceived as a threat to the Chinese. Whether you like it or not, the decision of siding with the US and being a key ally in this long battle to contain China has already been made on your behalf. Anyone that opposes this will be put on the sidelines if not prosecuted. The entire media landscape, right or left, has no room for dissent on this issue. Choices of these nature have strong consequences, and they will dictate the next 50 years of our lives. So what are the advantages we get from siding with the US? Well, backing from the largest naval power for the foreseeable future should not be looked at lightly. And in addition to this, we get reruns of Everybody Loves Raymond on Go Australia for a long time. I'm not complaining about that one. The disadvantages also need to be looked at. Being the front line of the next World War, if we are to the US what France was to Britain during the Second World War, we are in for a Battle of Australia, one where our security would genuinely be threatened. The chances of us winning this war are not low, but the cost of such a battle will surely be one that most Australians would rather avoid. Our economy would tank. We would not be in a position to maintain this sort of growth if we are a key ally of US ambitions in Asia Pacific. As an old African proverb says, when two elephants fight, the grass suffers the most. It is my opinion that our national interest is to maintain a balanced relationship between the elephants of the world. We cannot seem to be America's deputy sheriff in Asia Pacific, otherwise we will suffer consequences beyond comprehension for most Australians. Your fears of a Chinese invasion are not completely unfounded, but just step back and think for a minute. Is our foreign policy increasing this threat or reducing it? Rightly or wrongly, China's behavior that we consider threatening comes from their own perceived national interests. Percy Splendor, who laid out our foreign policy objectives in the 50s, also said something pertinent today. Democracies must accept the fact that any policy of appeasement is completely ineffective and dangerous. As much as this applied to the Soviet Union then and China now, it also applies to our relationship with the US, which we sometimes forget.